to me, the idea of resilience is that you stay the course, right? Isn't that like a euphemism that we use? You stay the course. You're being resilient. You're holding your place. You're holding your ground.
Mm.
How does that fly in the face of being able to change? I mean, yes, I know that life is a tightrope walk.
Yeah. So
Now,
maybe there's a distinction, right? So if resilience is staying the course, or what a lot of people will say resilience is being able to bounce back, right? So we're living our life and the pandemic happens. Let's say we're talking about that. And all of these, dips in our functioning happen, right? Like the way that we live our life, the sort of compromises that we have to make. And so resilience is being able to bounce back to probably the way that you were prior to that thing happening. So that's resilience. It's having the skills to, bounce back. And when we're talking about changing or shifting or growing or thriving, that's where I'm fascinated by and always have been this experience of post-traumatic growth, which is distinct from resilience. Resilience is bouncing back, whereas post-traumatic growth is the growth or benefit finding that happens not because of the pandemic or the stuff that happens, but because of our struggle with it.
I've seen two different, let's say, ends of the spectrum this year. I've seen some people that delegate extremely and don't have a lot of control. And on the other end, I see that person that's trying to squeeze the cap off the pin this way instead of just opening it up because they won't relinquish control because they think they're the only ones that can do this. And through times like Victoria was talking about, when you are going through a trying time, anyone can run a business. Anyone can be a parent when times are great. It's when times aren't great that really separates how you react and what you're doing.
I realized very, very quickly that I just let go of everything. I said, this all has to change. There is no going back. Because once we went to that place, I just realized it was always going to be different. Do you think that I know that probably will work for some people, but what's your take on that, Victoria?
Post-traumatic growth, if we're looking at, how do we grow through this, one of the main symptoms of it, or, is being able to let go and be like Gumby and be more flexible. And, if we're looking at the 6 human needs, that Tony Robbins talks about often, certainty is actually one of the 6 human needs. And when we have the need for certainty of how things are going to go, it actually is the antithesis of growth. And so if we were to put growth as one of the 6 human needs on top, certainty surely has to be somewhere closer to the bottom. And finding a way to, have variety in our life and see what can I do with what I have? How can I maximize? How can I let go of the idea and be married? Like you guys are in branding and marketing and things like that. And I often think about when we collaborate with people or we have an idea, if we're married to that idea, it can sometimes be the death of us.
I think what 2020 has just shined the spotlight on is being a perpetual student. If you're not constantly learning, if you're not constantly trying to see what you can do and try different things, it's the old sales adage or business adage, you're either moving forwards or backwards, you're rarely standing still. So I think it's been a good time to put your head down and kind of learn a little bit, maybe then pick your head up and say, okay, I'm going to try this and see how it works for a period of time. And Twitch, because I know from a marketing standpoint that we mentioned earlier, a lot has changed over 2020. There is so much information in front of us all the time and people are in front of it all the time that you kind of have to find ways to stand out from the crowd and not just get muddled in the noise.
I love what you were both saying about being a student, right? Like not being all knowing, because again, it's like the all knowing that creates the stop to growth as well. So here's a new presentation, right, of our context. None of us know the way. And so one of the things I learned when I was a researcher was I may know the way, but if the situation or context or other person is saying, no, this is what works, I should be able to say, okay, I'll try it that way because I don't know. So just being able to say, I don't know. It's actually one of the best leadership skills you can have.
One of the interesting things as an icebreaker, I find, is to ask people to tell a mentor story. It's really interesting because you get to talk about somebody else. But that famous Wayne Dyer quote, if you spot it, you got it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it goes in both directions. That sounds like a negative trap you can step in, but it's also a positive one. For most people, it's a fairly easy story to tell. But ultimately, you're talking about yourself,
Mm,
which is great.
it's
It's great.
beautiful.
So you talked about curiosity, you talked about that insight. Very often, it's difficult to be vulnerable. But if I can talk about that person over there or back there in my history, now I'm okay with that because I'm talking about them. But in reality, you're talking about you.
Oh, Paul, this is a post-traumatic growth exercise, actually. I just
Yeah.
did this with a bunch of parents who raise kids with autism, and we said, if you can't find your own strengths, look at the strengths of someone you really admire and create a story around their strengths. Like, if you had those strengths, what would you do in your story? It's very similar to what you just did with me. I love that.
I know I've coached people on this in business for years. And I think the same thing holds true personally. It's better to address a problem and have this much of an irritation on one party or the next, because if you don't address it and let it linger and brew, then you're going to have larger problems.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's so key to, what we're talking about in relationships, whether it's business or personal. If it's not honesty and truth, it's definitely something else. And a lot of the times, the reason we don't portray the authenticity is because of fear of losing, fear of being spoken about, fear of not being liked, but what ends up happening is it's us that suffer. And so whatever that truth is, just tell the truth.